Hi folks, the ASI2600 Pro astrophotography camera is pretty popular among amateur astrophotographers like myself. However, we have a particular problem because it's not just one model.
There's a mono version, there's a color version, there are duo models with a guide sensor built in, and there's even an AIR model with integrated ASI AIR control. So for newcomers, trying to figure out which one to pick can be a real headache. So in this video, I'd like to help you make an informed decision by discussing the main pros and cons for each type. I've personally tested several versions of the 2600 series over the past year. My wallet and my wife weren't too happy about it, but anyway, everything I share comes from real-world experience, and I hope that by the end of the video you will have a clear idea of which model fits your needs best and your budget, of course. I'm Guido Oerlemans and you are watching Guido's Astroforum.
Alright, before diving into the differences between the models, let's first discuss why the ASI2600 Pro is so popular among astrophotographers in the first place.
Well, it's not because of the price, because these cameras certainly aren't cheap. The ASI2600 Pro starts at around $1,500 for the base color model, and this goes all the way up to about $2,500 for the fully featured 2600MM AIR monochrome version. So why do many astrophotographers go for the 2600? Well, one big reason is the large 26 megapixel APS-C size sensor, and that's the same size you'll find in many high-end DSLR and mirrorless cameras. The larger sensor is especially useful for wider targets like the Andromeda Galaxy, which stretches several degrees across the sky. Instead of taking multiple shots of different sections and then having to stitch them together into one overall mosaic picture, you can often capture the entire object with the 2600 in a single photo. So cooling is another big advantage. All of the 2600 models, they have a two-stage Peltier cooler which drops the camera sensor temperature down to minus 35 degrees Celsius below ambient temperature. So if you compare that to using a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, when you take long exposure photos, heat tends to build up in the camera sensor, and that heat will introduce some random electronic noise. Those are the red, green and blue pixels you often see on long exposure photos, especially on hot days. So cooling your camera keeps the data really clean, keeps your pictures really clean, and it improves your signal to noise ratio.
Hi folks, I do hope you find this technical video about the ASI2600 interesting. If you do, please consider liking the video and subscribing or joining the channel, which allows me to keep on creating content about astrophotography. For those of you who already did, thank you so much, and let's move on with the video.
Unlike DSLRs or mirrorless cameras, you don't have any live view screen or LED screen to control the camera. So it means you'll need some extra hardware and software. That's either your laptop with some astrophotography software installed on your laptop, or something like an ASI AIR Plus to control your camera. The functionality of the ASI AIR to control your camera and the rest of your astrophotography gear is actually integrated into the ASI2600 AIR, and we will talk about that later on in the video. So if you're into astrophotography for a decade or longer like me, you probably remember the older CMOS cameras which would suffer from amp glow. So luckily, with the introduction of Starvis technology and back illuminated sensor technology, the Sony IMX571 sensor inside the ASI2600 Pro series doesn't suffer from any amp glow, which makes life as an astrophotographer a lot easier. The Sony IMX571 sensor also provides a huge dynamic range thanks to its 16-bit analog to digital converter, giving you 65,000 levels of brightness to work with and a full well capacity of 50,000 electrons and a very low read noise, which means you can capture faint nebulosity while also keeping bright stars in the picture from oversaturating. So all the Pro models include 512 megabyte internal memory for smooth data transfer and a built-in USB hub with at least 2 USB ports to power other accessories you might have, like your filter wheel, your focuser, your rotator, or another device. And the AIR version expands this even further with 4 USB ports plus 3 12-volt power outputs to power other Astro devices. So now that we've covered why the ASI2600 series is so popular, let's also tackle the big question of this video. Which model, mono, color, duo or AIR, is the best match for your astrophotography workflow?
One of the most important decisions you need to make is, are you going for a color camera or a monochrome camera? So let me do my best and explain what the main differences are between the two.
So color cameras like the ASI2600MC Pro, they are generally more affordable and easier to use as compared to a monochrome version. In this case, the ASI2600MC Pro costs about $1,500 and the camera includes a built-in IR cut filter, so you can start imaging just like you would with a regular DSLR or mirrorless camera. So you don't need extra filters or a filter wheel necessarily unless you really want to add those features. For example, if you deal with light pollution or city glow, you can add a broadband light pollution filter like an Optolong L Pro or an IDAS LPS. Also, if you want to enhance contrast, you can consider a duo or tri-band filter, a narrowband filter that is, in front of your color camera like the Optolong L Extreme or L Ultimate. And this is especially useful to capture hydrogen, alpha and oxygen emissions from emission nebulae. So why do people use monochrome cameras instead of color cameras? Well, the biggest catch of a color camera is that it is less efficient at capturing specific colors because of its Bayer matrix in front of the camera. So half the pixels of a color camera are covered with green filters, a quarter with red and another quarter with blue filters, and we call this a so-called RGB pattern. What that means is that when red light, for instance, from an emission nebula hits your sensor, only the red filtered pixels are able to record it, while the rest of the filters will block that red light coming onto your camera sensor. The same goes for blue light, which is only recorded when it passes through a blue filter. So with a color camera, only about 25% of the pixels capture red, only 25% capture blue, and about half capture green light. So all of this means you're going to be less efficient, especially in capturing red and blue light as compared to using a monochrome camera. With all that said, let me show you some real-world pictures I stacked and processed using the ASI2600MC Pro. So here is a color picture of the Andromeda Galaxy and also the Pleiades without using any filter at all. And I have two pictures of the Orion and the Horsehead Nebula where I used a combination of an HA filter and the color camera. Overall, I'm very satisfied with the quality of the pictures of the 2600MC Pro color camera. We also have the monochrome version, the ASI2600MM Pro. Currently, that sits around $2,000, so that's already $500 more expensive than the color version. It also requires you to get an extra filter set and probably also a filter wheel, which makes the setup more expensive and also more complex. Now, this being said, I do have to emphasize that mono cameras are more efficient at capturing light. So, for example, when I put a red filter in front of my ASI2600 monochrome camera, all of the red light will pass through that filter onto every pixel of the camera, so you don't waste any light. And that means better signal-to-noise ratio, and it means a higher quality picture. Now, you can shoot broadband with a monochrome camera, for which you have to use LRGB filters, as they are called, meaning red, green and blue filters, plus a luminance filter that captures all visible light to boost the detail of the entire photo. You can also use narrowband filters like HA, S2 and O3 filters. And these narrowband filters, they isolate the exact wavelengths of light emitted by gases inside an emission nebula. while blocking the rest of the light. So that's especially useful if you're imaging under light polluted skies like me. Now, I mainly use my monochrome ASI2600MM Pro camera for narrowband imaging, so let me also show you a couple of pictures I took with this camera. I just want to remind you that imaging with a monochrome camera does take more effort because you have to capture objects in different colors using different filters, and then you need to combine all these photos into one overall color picture of the object you want to image. That being said, the image quality is as good as it gets. So what's the bottom line? Well, if you're after top-tier image quality and willing to spend more effort and money, monochrome is the way to go. But if you'd rather keep things simple while still getting outstanding results, a color camera also delivers.
So let's move on to discussing the DUO cameras, which have an interesting guide sensor in addition to the main camera sensor.
The ASI2600 DUO is a special version of the 2600 series. It combines your main imaging sensor with a built-in guide sensor, so in theory, you don't need a separate guide camera or guide scope. Price-wise, the DUO is about $300 more expensive than the regular Pro models. The Color Pro is around $1,500, while the Color Duo is about $1,800. The Mono Pro is about $2,000 and the Mono Duo is closer to $2,300. So the extra $300 is basically what you'd spend on a separate guide setup anyway. For instance, if you would buy an ASI2600MM Mini guide camera with a 30mm guide scope, you would spend about $270, or let's say you want to buy the newer ASI220 Mono Mini with a 50mm guide scope, that would be around $400. So the Duo isn't really that cheaper compared to buying a separate guide camera and a guide scope, but it's mainly about convenience. So let's talk about the pros and cons of having that guide sensor inside the main camera. So the main pro is that this is a very clean and simple design. You only need one camera and one USB cable, and there is an SC2210 guide sensor inside your main camera, which is very sensitive. So let's also talk about the cons. The guide sensor sits about 20mm off center from the main imaging sensor, close to the edge of the telescope's image circle, where light fall off is stronger. This is why filter size and image circle matter. A 1¼ inch filter is too small, and even 36mm filters are borderline, so the safe choice if you want to use filters with this Duo camera is to go for a 2-inch filter with M48 threads on a telescope that delivers at least a 44mm image circle, so enough light can reach the guide sensor. For example, my ZWO FF80 telescope has a 44mm image circle, and with 2-inch filters, the Duo guided very well when I was shooting broadband targets like galaxies and clusters. In my case, I was actually using the AIR model, but since it uses the same SC2210 guide sensor as the Duo, the experience would be identical with the Duo. With broadband, it performed great, but once I switched to narrowband filters, the guide sensor didn't get enough light, so I had to push the gain and the exposure time higher, which quickly became a bit inconvenient. I also tested the Duo on my Celestron Edge HD 8-inch, which has a corrected image circle of about 42mm. Again, imaging with broadband filters or without any filters was completely fine, but once I started to use narrowband filters, I ran into a similar issue. I needed to increase the gain and the exposure time to multiple seconds to successfully initiate guiding. Now, long exposure guiding isn't such a good match, especially when you're using harmonic drive mounts like the ZWO AM5 or the Ioptron HAM, which perform best with quick corrections of the guide sensor of around 1 to 2 seconds. Another issue was that at 2000mm focal length with the Edge HD, the Duo's guide sensor field of view is very small, so sometimes I couldn't find an appropriate guide star within that small field of view. In those cases, I really had to go back to using a separate guide scope and camera. So here's my conclusion about the Duo. If you mainly shoot in broadband and you want the cleanest, most cable-free rig possible, the Duo is excellent. But if you also spend a lot of time on narrowband imaging, if you have a long focal length telescope, or your telescope has a limited imaging circle, the safer route would be to buy a regular Pro plus a separate guide setup.
Alright folks, let's move on to the final part of the video where we are going to discuss the ASI2600 AIR smart camera, which actually features a lot of the functionality you'd also find in a separate ASI AIR Plus. Let's get into it.
The ASI2600 AIR is ZWO's all-in-one smart camera. Instead of buying a Pro or a Duo and a separate ASI AIR Plus, the AIR puts everything into one body. The IMX571 imaging sensor, the built-in 2-megapixel guide sensor, and the full ASI AIR software with Wi-Fi and 256 gigabytes of onboard storage. If you never used an ASI AIR before, think of it as ZWO's control computer for your astrophotography rig. You can control it from your phone or tablet and handle polar alignment, plate solving, focusing, guiding, do auto runs, and of course store your photos. Normally, this is a separate box which sits on your astrophotography rig, but in the ASI2600 AIR, the computer lives inside your camera. The biggest benefit of the ASI2600MC AIR is its integration. Because the guide sensor and the ASI AIR computer are built in, you immediately lose two USB cables. No USB cable needed from your main camera to a standalone ASI AIR Plus, and no USB cable needed for an external guide camera. The rig is cleaner and lighter, and meridian flips can be less stressful because there is less chance of cable snag. We already covered the guide sensor pros and the cons in the Duo, so let's discuss the pros and cons of having an ASI AIR inside the camera. When comparing prices, the MC Duo is about $1,800 and the MC AIR about $2,000. On the mono side, the MM Duo is about $2,300 and the MM AIR is about $2,500. So the AIR costs roughly $200 more than a Duo camera. A standalone ASI AIR Plus is about $300, so it's cheaper to buy the ASI2600MC AIR as compared to buying a Duo plus a separate ASI AIR Plus if you wanted that controller anyway. Now, the trade-off of choosing the AIR over a separate ASI AIR Plus is connectivity and power options. The AIR body provides 4 USB 2.0 ports and has 3 12-volt outputs, but one of those outputs must power the camera, so only 2 remain to power extra accessories. Standalone ASI AIR Plus, by contrast, gives you 2 USB 3.0 ports, 2 USB 2.0 ports, and 4 dedicated 12-volt outputs. Most deep sky accessories work perfectly fine on USB 2.0 outputs like mounts, guiders, filter wheels, and focusers. They all don't need a very high bandwidth. So I tested the 2600 AIR during several sessions and it runs very smoothly, and also having to deal with fewer cables makes the setup much cleaner and simple. Just keep power in mind. If your astrophotography rig uses extra things like a rotator, a filter wheel, a focuser, a dew heater, and maybe you have other accessories that need to be powered, the 2 12-volt outputs may not be enough. So my conclusion is that if you want simplicity with fewer cables, the ASI2600MC or MM AIR are an excellent choice. But if your setup needs more power connections, the Pro or Duo combined with a separate ASI AIR Plus will give you more flexibility in this respect. So let me give you my final wrap-up and conclusion. When it comes to choosing between the different versions, it really depends on your style of imaging. The ASI2600MC Pro, that's the color version, is the easiest to use and the most affordable camera. It is a fantastic option if you just want to get started quickly and still produce beautiful one-shot color images. The monochrome version, that's the ASI2600MM Pro, demands more investment in terms of filters and a filter wheel, but in return it delivers the very highest image quality and flexibility for both broadband and narrowband imaging. If you want to simplify your rig, the ASI2600 Duo is also worth considering. With its built-in guide sensor, it eliminates the need for an extra guide camera and guide scope, and for broadband imaging this works very well. However, it does have some limitations when you use it for narrowband imaging and with long focal length telescopes, and you need a big enough image circle of at least 44mm. Finally, there's the ASI2600 which integrates the guide sensor and the full ASI AIR system inside the camera. This model offers the cleanest, most cable-free setup, and it is also more cost-effective than buying an ASI AIR Plus separately. The main trade-off is that it provides fewer power outputs and only USB 2.0 connections, so it may not be the best choice for more complex rigs with lots of accessories that need to be powered.
Alright folks, thanks so much for sticking with me until the end of the video, and I only have one question left for myself, which is, which of these cameras do I need to sell? Alright, clear skies and see you next time.